Okay, which was under the Jewish law what? Blasphemy. And if they get him guilty of blasphemy, what can they say? They can put him to death, or at least under Jewish law, they can put him to death. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that because they couldn't always do what they wanted to do, and so they had to bring the Romans in, and that's why some other charges get brought. But that's what they're doing. They're trying to lay the groundwork to impeach him with the people and to have an excuse for getting rid of him. And the longer it goes on, the longer he's teaching, the more crowds that he attracts, the more people that he's teaching, the more people that are being influenced by his teaching, the more pressing that becomes for them. And so that's what's going on. Now he's moving toward Jerusalem. He's not there yet, but he's moving in that direction. He's getting closer to Jerusalem. They come out specifically to put him to the test and to try to deter him. And they ask him an interesting question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Look, this is still a highly emotional question to this very day that is the source of all sorts of debate and discussion and dissent and argument. And there's a passage in the Bible that says there's nothing new under the sun. This is proof. Nearly 2,000 years ago, if you wanted to get someone in trouble, you asked for their views on divorce. Today, you want to get someone in trouble in the church, what do? So, nothing new. These are problems. Now, what that tells us is a couple of things. Number one, this is a very fundamental and important topic. That's the first thing it tells us. People are passionate about things that affect them. They're generally not passionate about things that don't affect them. I'll give you an example. I'm not being political. I'm going to cut anybody off that tries to draw this into a political discussion. This is just a really good example right now. There has been a lot of traffic from outside the United States coming over the U.S. southern border for decades. Nobody outside of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas cared for decades. Now, all of a sudden, people in New York, in California, in the northern sections of California, and Chicago, and all these places are starting to yell and scream about the problem. You want to know why? Because it came to their backyard. When it was far removed from them and it didn't really affect them, they didn't care.
They don't care. They don't care. It's far away.
Yeah, we only care about things that affect us. This tells us that this is a fundamental thing that affects people and has always affected people and likely will always affect people. So it is an important thing for us to consider. And we want to notice how Jesus responds, what his response is, and I'm going to tell you up front, it's really simple. There's nothing complicated about what he says here. What you'll hear a lot from a lot of people is, ooh, that's a complicated issue. This is not a complicated answer. You know how this issue becomes complicated? When it affects me and I want to do something different. Now all of a sudden it becomes complicated. But let's look at what he says. So they come, they think, okay, if we ask him a question about this, boy, he is going to hang himself. He answered, what did Moses command you? So it goes back to the law. Now, the reason he raises the law as a question here, or as an answer here, is because that's what they lived under at the time. What did Moses command you? They said Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And I think it's Deuteronomy 24 is the primary chapter that you can go read that on your own time and deal with all the ins and outs of what was involved in that command. I'm pretty sure that's where it was recorded. I may have the chapter wrong, and if I do, I'll update it later, or somebody else can correct me who's fact checking me as we go along here. But he says, they answer, well, Moses said you could write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And in fact, that is what the law said. And Jesus said to them, because of the hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation. And so now he's going to go in his answer to before. He's actually teaching them. His question is it offered to engage their mind. Okay, what did Moses tell you? Well, Moses said we could give him a certificate of divorce before we send him away. All right, now let me tell you, the reason that command was given is because you have stubbornness in you. But if you go back to the beginning of creation, and you read, and he quotes from Genesis, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. I want to stop there for just a moment. I don't know that we talk about this a lot when we're studying early in Genesis. Maybe we ought to bring it up more. Do you notice way back there in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, he talks about leaving father and mother. How many people were in the world when he was talking? 2. Adam and Eve. He had just made them. But he's already talking about fathers and mothers and leaving and cleaving in marriage before those things were even possible. And that's part of the point that Jesus is making. If you go back to the beginning, you're going to find out the intent that God has. From the very outset, he said, after making them male and female, you're going to leave your father and mother. If you got a father and a mother, that assumes something must have taken place. What? There has to be a birth of a child. You don't have a father and mother without a child. You shall leave your father and mother and shall cleave to your wife or hold fast to your wife, depending on what translation you're reading. They're no longer 2, but one flesh. Now, before we go any further, let me ask you this. I have a couple of things. I have a machete that I use to keep my banana trees under control. And then I have a katana that hangs on my wall. Both of them quite capable of removing body parts. Who wants to lose part of their body? What can I chop off of you? Yeah, nobody wants to lose anything, right? Much less me like whacking you in half, completely split you in 2. You know, Solomon, yeah, give me the baby, okay? Y'all arguing about the baby. We'll split it hand me a sword. I'm going to split it in half. Give a half to each of you. No, nobody wants that to happen, right? That's how he's describing marriage. The two have become one flesh. When you got one flesh, you don't tear it apart. Unless you're trying to do what? Unless you're trying to do harm. They are no longer 2, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together. Who did the joining? God. Let not man separate. Let not man separate. I'm going to there's a phrase for you. Raise your hand if you have trouble understanding, let not man separate. What that statement means is that in order for anyone to have the authority to effect a divorcement, that authority must be granted by God. God has joined them together. Man doesn't have the authority to separate them. So before you start separating the marriage, you got to find some affirmative authority where God has said, yes, you can do that. And the underlying principle behind that is, at the beginning he made them male and female and said, a man shall leave his father and mother, shall hold fast to his wife, and the two have become one. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Yes.
He said that Moses permitted a man to watch different divorce. He didn't say God.
Well, and I'm not going to, that is a point. I'm not going to argue that too much because Moses spoke under the authority of God and the law did permit it. But this is important. God granted that authority, specific circumstances, and a specific process of which to follow. Were they at liberty to separate their marriages any way they wanted to? No. They only could follow what was commanded through Moses. That's kind of important. Raise your hand if you live under the law of Moses. Yeah, neither do I, so that doesn't apply to us. Yes, ma'am.
And I've been searching through this for years.
Yep.
But I looked up some other scriptures like from Jeremiah 3:1, and it talked about it compared the divorced woman to a harlot. But anyway, Jeremiah 3:1.
Yep.
Compared to a harlot, I think that's how bad it was, how God felt about it. And it said that the woman is defiled. I wrote that. The woman was considered defiled by the second marriage. She was able to remarry, but the first man, husband, could not come back to her.
Exactly. Correct. That initial marriage was considered defiled. You couldn't go back into that initial marriage. Once certificate was given, once the divorce was effected, once God honored the divorce, that was it.
I wrote that Israel committed, it was talking about Israel committing adultery against God, and it was also referring to like a divorced woman committing adultery. Well, maybe we can read it and it makes more clear, but it's.
Yeah, I'm familiar. I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I presume most of the people in the class are. If you're not,
The land. It was, I didn't write it down per se, but anyway, the divorce wife was compared to Israel committing adultery.
correct.
And then I wrote down Malachi 2:14-16.
Correct.
So they didn't deal with treacherous spirits.
Right.
And then Matthew 19:9, it's talking about except for sexual immorality, and it described what sexual immorality was considered.
Right.
As far as, the exception. But when you go to 1 Corinthians
7.
7, it talks about husband and wife should remain unmarried, but if they can't, if they are to separate, that they're to remain apart. And God talks about there's a possibility of how do you know you might not save your husband or
Right.
your wife or
So how do you reconcile all that together?
And all of that goes together to say that, like we were saying, it was not God's intent for man to divorce. That's something man took upon himself for whatever reasons he chooses, to want to separate from his spouse. But it all adds up to a bunch of giving part.
Right.
Whatever.
Well, yeah, and okay, short response without spending the entire balance of the class actually breaking down all of those texts. The stuff from the Old Testament, the prophets and the law itself, you take it all together, first off, that is under the law of Moses. That is writing about the law of Moses. That has to do with the law that was given through Moses and describing it. Now, the passages that you brought up, like Jeremiah and Malachi, that talk about the general view that God has, those are very instructive. You can't, again, misunderstand, I am the Lord your God, I hate divorce. That's hard to misunderstand. It is not what God desires. It is not what his intent is. In divorce, you always have people doing things differently than the way that God intended them to do. You go back to Jesus' teaching that's recorded in Mark here. From the beginning, he said, God made them male and female, and what's his intent? That a man should leave his father and mother and should cleave to his wife, and the two should no longer be two, but should be one. Okay, that's his intent. And you get those passages of the prophets saying, I hate divorce, and you realize that his intent is for that to stay together. That's the intent. So when there is a division, even if it is an allowed division, which there was some under the law of Moses, there's one exception given in Matthew 19 under the law of Christ. Even if it is an allowance by God, it's not what God wants. We have the same reason today that we had when Jesus spoke here. What did Moses say? Moses said, give her a certificate of divorce. What's Jesus' response to that? That command was given because of the hardness of your hearts. Because I am unwilling to do what God desires. Because I am unwilling to even forgive if necessary. By the way, I do think there's a reason for that exception. I think that the intimacy of the relationship is so great. And by the way, throughout the Bible, infidelity in marriage is compared to our infidelity with God spiritually. Constantly. That's constantly put before us. Sin is referred to as adultery. James writes, you adulterers, talking about people who are engaged in sin. God understands what it feels like for someone to be unfaithful. And so he has made a provision in that singular case to say, okay, the breach of trust is too great for them to bear. And if they are unable and they seek a divorce, I'll grant it in that exception. But that's the exception. That's not the rule. What's the rule? That a man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and two shall be one flesh. Yes, ma'am.
God, I think it was Paul, who said that they were to only, I think it's in Corinthians, that they were only to marry in the Lord if they were to marry.
Right. Which is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult passages to try to make sense of. It's not saying it can't be made sense of, and I do have my view, but it's a tough passage. What he means by in the Lord there is it's tough to discern. Yeah. Now, right. That's a lot of people's thought. What I'm going to tell you about 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Corinthians 7's role in this discussion. First off, if you go to the context of the book, it is in a section of the book where he says, now concerning the things in which you wrote. He had received a letter from them. They clearly had some particular questions for him. It is part of his response to some of those questions. Leading up to that discussion, he talks about the present distress. The best way I could describe that is to say this. They were in the middle of a period of time where there was great persecution against people because of their Christianity. The other thing that was unique about that time is there were an awful lot of people who were being converted out of Judaism or out of idolatry into Christianity. Because I come to faith does not necessarily mean that my spouse is going to come to faith. So I have come to faith. My spouse has not yet come to faith. And all of a sudden, life gets really, really hard on the family because of what? I'm a Christian, and I'm being persecuted now. And in those cases, sometimes what might an unbelieving spouse do? Depart. I ain't going to put myself in jeopardy. This is dangerous. These people are trying to kill us. I'm getting out of here. And that is specifically what's being clearly addressed in that chapter. Whatever state you're in, you stay in that state. If you're married, you stay married. If you're not married, listen, if you can go without being married, that's great. That's what he tells them. But then he says, when it comes to fornication, you get married, you don't commit fornication. It's better to be married than to burn. So he says, you're married, you stay married. You stay married. But if your unbelieving spouse departs, I'm going to give you some instructions about how to handle that. And what does he say? You remain alone, or you reconcile with your mate. The hope is that eventually one of two things could happen. The mate could eventually come to faith, and then they would be desirous of being together again. Or persecution dies down. And what they're really running from is the persecution, not you. And so maybe they want to come back. Maybe that reconciliation can take place. But that's the instruction that they get. And there's some very specific circumstances that they're going through that create that situation. Now, some of that still happens today. Sometimes you have a believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse, and the unbelieving spouse says, look, I didn't sign up for this. I'm not living like this. I like doing what I do, and I'm going to go. You're not bound in such a case as a statement that's made in 1 Corinthians 7. You know what that means? He's just described responsibilities that husbands have to their wives and wives have to their husbands and told them, don't forsake fulfilling those responsibilities. And then he says, but if your unbelieving spouse departs, you're not bound in such a case. In other words, you don't have to chase them around and continue to fulfill your obligation if they have deserted you. But he does say what? You must remain alone. The other case that can come up in modern times is you have two believing spouses, and one spouse just goes off the rails and goes back into the world and becomes unfaithful to God and unfaithful to his family and unfaithful to his wife or his gender. Forget the gender tags. It can work both ways. Sometimes that confuses people. If they depart, you're not bound in such a case. By the way, under Matthew 19, you know that you actually have the authority from God to do what? For you to put them away. You don't have to, but you have been granted that authority. But if they depart, what can I do? Remain faithful. That's what I can do. Continue to respect God. So that is the reconciling all those pieces of information together. That's the short version of how it all works. But what needs to be underscored and what Mark is talking about here is God's general attitude about marriage, which is intended to be between a man and a woman and intended to be permanent. They ask him, what do you say about this question? He says, this is what I say about it. From the beginning, this is what God did, this is what he wants. And they did not misunderstand it, but, and this is important, verses 10, 11, and 12. So this is his public teaching that we just talked about. They get back in the house at this point. And the disciples ask him again about this matter. So, okay, we've got these Pharisees who come and bring up this question to try to create division and to try to impugn his character and reputation and to impeach him as a teacher. When they get into the privacy of a house, his disciples actually come to him and they want more information. So they ask him this, whoever divorces his wife, they ask him more about this matter, and this is his response to his disciples. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And so it works both ways, and that's the important part about this passage in Mark, is it works both ways, and this makes it clear. But again, this is addressing the general principle of divorce. This is not addressing the exception that's raised in Matthew 19. Generally speaking, if you divorce without authority and you marry again, what state are you in? Adultery. Not hard. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Hard to misunderstand this. The only way that this doesn't apply is if you have been granted specific authority to divorce. Otherwise, this applies. And that creates a lot of problems because there are a lot of people today who just divorce for any cause at all and get married again and divorce again and get married again and divorce again. I once studied with a young lady. It came out in passing in a lesson, actually. I used this as an illustration. She was a member of the local church. She comes to me, she said, I almost walked out. I got so angry. Then I realized I needed to talk to you. We sat down, we talked about her situation. I let people come to their own conclusions. I just cover the material and I let them come to their own awareness of what's being taught. And she realized that she was in a marriage that was adulterous. But you know, it was horrifying to me. She was young. She was in her 20s. It wasn't just her second marriage. It was already her third marriage. I'm scratching my head. How does a 20-something-year-old already find themselves married and divorced so many times? And it's a society that basically has said marriage doesn't matter. And divorce doesn't matter. And all it's about is your personal happiness. And that's why I made such a big deal about the fact that this is a foundational principle about human relationships to one another and to God. He goes all the way back to creation and says we were created for this purpose. Does that sound like something that's not important? That doesn't matter? And by the way, We've now talked about this for what, 20 minutes? I also brought up at the beginning of our discussion that this is still relevant today. There's nothing new under the sun. It still creates questions and problems, and people realize, wait a minute, if that's true. By the way, and I think it's the Matthew 19 passage, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. It could be one of the other ones, but I'm almost certain it's Matthew 19. When he does the teaching there, the disciples actually say, well, wait a minute. If that's true, then it's better not to marry. Do you realize what that means? That means his disciples, upon coming to a realization about the nature of the relationship and how solid it is intended to be, and how fundamental it is, and how permanent it is, they're like, well, maybe it would be better to not do it at all then. And his response is, not everyone can accept that. So, and by the way, he's not saying not everyone can accept the truth of what I just taught or the conclusion that you just drew. Not everyone can make it through life alone, because you have to be also mindful of something that's not addressed in this text. I think he skipped that line. Yes, he did in this particular text. It is not good that a man should be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. Not everyone can decide to not marry, to avoid the difficulties and complications. Listen, it's a serious choice, a serious decision. You're making a life-altering decision that is intended by God to be a permanent joining together that you don't have the authority to separate without his saying, yes, you can do it. We need to take it a whole lot more seriously than we do. And people need to be aware of the lifelong consequences of these kinds of choices. It's probably the second most important choice a person ever makes in their life. What's the first most important choice? Whether or not you're going to walk with God. Whether or not you're going to become the bride of Christ. So the first choice is whether or not you're going to be joined to God. And the second most important choice is, who is going to be my partner in this life? Who am I going to join myself to as I walk in this world? By the way, that fits everything else that Jesus taught, which was that the things that are above, the spiritual things, the relationship with God, is more important than the things that are on the earth, the physical things, the relationship with your spouse. That's the most important relationship. The second is like unto it. By the way, Ephesians 5 makes it very clear that the second is actually like unto it, because he discusses at length the relationship between a man and his wife, and then says, this mystery is great, but I'm talking to you about Christ and the church. So there is a great correlation between these relationships. Yes, ma'am. And that's Romans 7. Right. That's an extremely astute and valuable observation. But listen, it's hard. It's hard because it's fundamental. Because it is a part of the creative purposes of God. And so, listen, getting those fundamental things right, extremely important. This is why we ought to be teaching young people about these things. This is also why the family unit is the absolute foundation of life in time. Societies are built on families. Local churches are built on families. Every other human relationship stems out of the familial relationship. It's not just something we invented on our own. And so it's so important for us to get it and learn it and teach it to young people. Because what they're learning from the world is, get married, and if it don't work out, find somebody else. It's okay. It's not okay. It's not good. And it will destroy many people. Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Yep.
Difficult decisions and choices to make in his life. And you have the opportunity to choose.
You do. We always have the opportunity to choose, but we need to choose carefully, because there is a judgment where decisions are going to be made about our eternity based upon the way that we reacted to the truths that we encountered in life. You will be judged based upon the deeds that have been done in the body. It matters what I do. It matters what I believe. It matters how I act. I will answer. And it works on so many different levels. Listen, let's take the divorce part of it out of the equation. Assuming there is no divorce, there's still answers to be made in the relationship. Have I been the kind of husband that I am obligated to be? Have I been the kind of wife that I'm obligated to be? Have we been the kind of parents that we are obligated to be? Have we done our duty within these relationships? We're going to have to answer for it. What effect have I had on other people's relationships? Let's assume I'm single and free and actually have a right before God to marry, and I see someone else and I'm attracted to them and I think they're great and wonderful, and I think, boy, they would be such a great helpmeet for me, but they're already in a relationship. You know what a lot of people would say? I don't care, I want them. This is just so natural. It feels right. No. They're not to be considered in that regard. They're joined to someone else. All right, got to stop.